Thanks very much. Thank you. If you can all hear me good enough, I might suggest just to see some of these things, if you're at the far back, you could come up with. If you prefer the back, you know, they say the nearer the altar, the farther from God. So it's up to you. So you're all welcome. I know you've had a good day yesterday and a good night as well. And I just thank Brian and Pierre indeed for this today. Yes. Okay, that's well done. You can now stay at the back. It's actually my first time to come to this campus as a campus. The last time I was here was as a mental hospital, but I hasten to add, not as a customer, but my uncle was the chief psychiatrist of the then Eastern Health Board. And he himself, I was talking recently, is very happy that this place is now a campus because it has a measure of sort of brightness which contrasts with his time when he was here. He was the person who symbolically knocked down the very high walls which surrounded the place. And he himself, as a musician, he was a jazz trumpeter, a guitarist, a singer, who later converted to be a uilleann piper. And he's now 87 and he still sees people 3 days a week, so he's doing something right in his life. Radio and traditional music are two separate worlds. They could have entirely separate existences, like two people who never meet. You know, they might never meet, they would have separate lives, but on the other hand, they could meet and they have a relationship. And that's the way with radio and traditional music. It's like a sort of a Venn diagram where you have two circles with an intersection. One of the circles is radio and one is traditional music, and the intersection is the area of common activity, but it's not actually static. That's the interesting thing. The two worlds are ever changing, and therefore the area of activity is very dynamic. And that's that intersection I'm hoping to look at today. It's 90 years this year since the first day's broadcasting from 2RN, which is the station was known as then. It's now Radio. Then it went to Radio Air, now RTE. And we don't have a lot of time. We have to go at the speed of sound to cover 90 years in 40 or 50 minutes. So this won't cover everything, just some points of interest. It is a sort of a work in progress. But I joined RTE, believe it or not, in 1975 in September, so I have seen 41 of the first 90 years at first hand, you might say. Now, that first day's broadcasting in 1926, I'm going to show you the schedule, because what you see really is a concert on air for about 2.5 hours. And what you don't see, of course, and it's naturally you don't given the era, is the many things that are on radio nowadays. You've no news, no sport, no phone-in programs, no drama. So here's a couple of quotes from that era, and I'll just show you them here now. First of all, that's a picture of the ideal couple, and the first one, it says that radio, this was the day before the station took to the air, said that this new invention will be especially welcome to those who dwell in rural parts where dullness of life often makes for discontent and sets youth along pleasure paths that lead to sin and crime. So now you know, if you didn't know what the radio was for, you know now. The station was opened by Dr. Douglas Hyde, who was the first president of Conradh na Gaeilge, which I'll say something about in a minute. And he was also the first president of Ireland, though he was neither at the time. And he said, this is an era in which our nation will take its place amongst the other nations of the world. A nation is never made by an act of parliament. A nation is made from the inside itself and is made first of all by music, songs, games and customs. I suppose he didn't mention language, given that he was in so prominent in Conradh na Gaeilge. Maybe he did. So you always have to remember that the station was born just 3 years after the country became independent, and it was even sooner after a very nasty civil war. So you can just imagine the circumstances of the time if you set it in all that context. And the idea or the guiding principle at the time was to create a sort of an Irish cultural consciousness. You know, if the country has been essentially occupied for X hundred years, suddenly the idea was to create something different. And one of the chief movers in this was Conradh na Gaeilge, or known as the Gaelic League, which was a language-cultural organisation. And their invisible, or maybe not so invisible hand, can be seen in the programming scheduling of that first day and onwards. The first director of broadcasting was a man called Seamus Clandillan. He was from Galway. He was a prominent and enthusiastic member of Conradh na Gaeilge. And you heard Douglas Hyde's words. He was also, as I say, the first president of the Conradh na Gaeilge. So the first night's schedule is this. Now, there first of all, you can't think that's the programme, but I just have it there if you can see it. And when you look at it, you see, I won't go through it all, but you see the Army number 1, you see 3 Gaelic songs by Seamus Clandillan, the director. Arthur Darley was a violin, primarily classical player, but he certainly knew Irish music. And when you go down through it, you see there James Ennis and Liam Andrews, 2 pipers playing together. Mairead Ní Donegan was married to Seamus Clandillan. Dinah Copeland was a classical pianist. She's on record. Her descriptions of the first night and the intimidating nature of being in a room with black curtains and no audience is just very funny. She just did it. The way she delivered her memories of that night are quite funny. But when you look at the music, it's a sort of in the mode of the lighter art music of the day, sort of post-Victorian, but with a heavy Irish sort of veneer superimposed on it. And the only thing that I can see there which would be considered as traditional music today is the two uilleann pipers, Seamus MacAngus, father of Seamus Ennis, who was namely also mentioned later, and William Andrews. If you were to take an event like the Willie Clancy Summer School, which is a sort of summer school for traditional music, starting in about a fortnight, I think the only two people who would be sort of featured there would be these two pipers. I think the rest wouldn't. Now, descriptions such as pure Irish music or authentic music, they personally don't work for me. I just don't like them. But I think you can say that this is sort of a thread which runs through the earliest recordings of traditional music right through to today. And it represents in some way an accepted sort of mainstream of traditional music. And you will know more than I do about Professor Blacking in Queen's University, but he reviewed Brandon Brannock's book Folk Music and Dances of Ireland, and he said, "We shall not begin to understand the unique characteristics of Irish traditional music or be able to relate it to the patterns of Irish culture and society until we know more of the folk view as expressed in the folk terminology rather than the language of the conservatoire." Brandon Brannock makes this point very forcefully when he reminds us that a violinist is not an educated fiddler any more than a fiddler is an untutored violinist. Traditional music, instrumental and vocal, is a system of music in its own right. It has its own rules. Brandon Brannock emphasises the concept of a tune as a total pattern, the absence of dynamics in traditional music, and the fact that the rules are acquired unconsciously by osmosis and by listening to and learning from other performers, because many of these rules are hidden in the deep structures of the music and cannot be learned by slavish imitation. They stimulate rather than hinder individual creativity. Thus, traditional players are not obsessed by the bookish idea that there can be only one correct version of a tune. So, I'm going to play just one piece of the sort of music that would have been heard on those early days of radio. It's not actually a radio recording, but it's a group called the Fingal Trio. And the piper is the piper who was on that first day, a fiddle player called Frank O'Higgins, who was frequently on radio, and a flute player called Jakes Cawley. But it is the sort of music, and the Fingal Trio were frequently on radio. To use today's term, the reach, the audience reach, and the answer is not many. Transmission was poor, reception was poor, receivers were poor as well. And for any person who owned a radio, there was a complicated system known as wet and dry batteries. I think it may have, I'd have to check, it took a week to charge the batteries. So, it was more well-to-do people who owned radios in a town, maybe a doctor, a teacher, a priest. And just in terms of reception, you see the people there with the headphones on. There was a particular thing known as a cat's whiskers for receiving it, and you would only listen on headphones. And Harry Bradshaw, who's an expert in radio and in recorded sound, was telling me that since you had headphones, only one person could listen. So what they would do is they would place the little headphones in an enamel bucket, and they'd all be on the floor without listening to it. So if you think of your LED televisions, it's quite a change since then. And there was definitely a bias in terms of radio listenership towards the east of the country, towards urban centres, affluence and class. And there's an example of this. There's a man called Paddy Cronin, who was a superb fiddle player. He recorded music in 1949 for Radio Éireann, but he never heard it himself in his life. He went to Boston, and that was the first time that he ever heard the radio. And years later, I actually asked him would he like to hear it, and he was fascinating man. He said he wouldn't want to hear it because even though you're talking about actually 50 years later, he said any person that hears himself playing, all he says is, I could do that, I could have done that better. So even after 50 years, he never heard his own playing, which is superb. But there are many stories of people making journeys across fields and gathering in neighbours' houses and people listening outside windows to radio and to traditional music recitals in that. So to some extent you might say that to the people in Radio Éire and the station, that traditional music is somewhat invisible. You could also say that it wasn't in touch with itself in any sort of academic or intellectual or analytical way. And certainly for many people in the classical music establishment world, which was that was the management of music in the Radio Éire of the day, the performance as opposed to the airs wasn't really valued. There were beautiful airs which could be noted and arranged for orchestra, once obtained from a player, but the actual rendering at the time didn't have the same value placed upon it. It'd be interesting to look at someone like Karl Hardebecke. He loved Irish music. He noted, not just the melodies but the ornamentation, but yet his primary thing, I would say, was arranging these people. It was the airs which attracted him. Auditions were conducted from the standpoint, of course, of what makes a good performance or a virtuoso player, but the question is in whose ears, because I think you could place a traditional fiddle player in front of two people, one of them skilled in traditional music and knowledgeable in it, and the other who was equally rooted in the classical or the trained music world, and they would look for and hear very different things. Now, I wouldn't overdo that point in the sense that many of the evaluations would come up with the same result, but not all of them and not all of the time. And to the extent that there was this shortfall in understanding of traditional music, it wasn't in the area of goodwill. The station had tremendous goodwill towards traditional music. It's more just in the level of knowledge or appreciation of a different idiom, or even an appreciation that there was a separate idiom altogether. So here's an account of just one audition of an accordion player called John Clifford in Cork. He said, they advertised in the paper that the auditions would be held in Cork on so-and-so dates, so I went for it. Dennis came with me Dennis Murphy was a superb fiddle player. But one of those things, Dennis didn't pass that lot. I did, first kick-off. Of the two of us, of course, Dennis was the best, but there you are. There were two of them there, Dr. Vincent O'Brien, who was the 2RM musical director, and Dr. Kieran, the director of radio, Delia Murphy's husband. She was a celebrated singer. They were doctors not of medicine, but of music. He was a highly intelligent man, that Kieran. He was ambassador during the war and also in Australia after the war. The first broadcast I made, I got the countdown after a couple of weeks. You will be glad to hear that you were auditioned successfully, and we'll let you know, and so on. And my God, I was delighted, and I did practice hard. I practiced like the blazes altogether till I was called for a broadcast. And the evaluations were they could be quite exacting in a certain way. I just picked one here, a written account of an audition. A very amateurish performance. I fear Mr. X does not really feel the music he plays, or if he does, he fails to impress his audience with the fact. So here's an audio example now of two contrasting fiddle playing styles. One is a formal player, trained player, you might say, a man called Tadhg Small of Limerick, who broadcasts very frequently. You could say he played the violin. Paddy Cronin, the man I mentioned earlier, probably never used the term violin in his life, I would say, but the fiddle. And in fairness, both of these were on the air, but you will hear the contrast to some extent. hear some differences there. But pleasant enough, like. So the situation continued on through the 1930s, and the main broadcast of traditional music there was just solo or duet recitals, and very formal. An announcer would say, and now Peter Brown would play the Fry's Breeches. He would then play So Air, then he would play True, and then at the end he would say, that was Peter Brown playing, like I say, like a classical recital. And they were always live, these performances. There was no recording possibilities. I think 1936 was when Radio Éireann actually got that capability, but recording was a facility to be used only as an exception, mainly because of price and cumbersome. If someone could come in and play live, why record it? But occasionally there would be talks or illustrated talks, and the inserts would be recorded. So someone would be talking as I am now, and then they would have to, as they're talking, drop the needle onto the revolving record. It was quite a skill. They could do it very well. They had chalk marks on the discs. The recordings made for radio were on acetate discs, which were cumbersome, as I say, and they could only hold minimal durations. They were also very fragile, designed for a limited number of plays. You know, after about 10 plays, the sound deteriorated. They were metal plates coated with lacquer, which wasn't as durable as the material used in commercial 78s, was shellac and then later vinyl. Like the important difference between 78 RPM discs and the acetate disc was that the acetates were once-off recordings. You couldn't copy them, so they were unique events each one, although they were played with the same needles, etc., etc. And there was no concept at that time, I don't think, of any form of preservation or archive. I don't believe that there was. So, as the 1920s moved into the 30s, there was the growth of ensembles, which would be larger groups, coming quickly enough to then frequent broadcast by Céilí bands. And you see, first of all, the Aughrim Slopes Trio, who were from Clare Galway border in 1927, and then the full Aughrim Slopes Céilí band in the 30s. The Ballynakill traditional players, I think, were the first Céilí band on air in 1929, and after that the Céilí band was a regular feature on radio, and the band's prestige would be greatly enhanced by being able to say, as heard on Radio Éireann. And I think that the recording companies tended to take their lead from what bands were on the radio. So I'm going to give a short extract from each of 4 Céilí bands. So when you talk about a Céilí band in a strange way, but the question here is of what type of Céilí band. They're distinct as between different types of instrumentation, styles of playing, arrangements, and what type of dancing, if any, the music is provided for. So in quick succession you hear that Ballynakill traditional players, which would be 2 flutes, 2 fiddles and a piano, a very simple thing. After that then, the Dublin Metropolitan Garda band, and that's up to 20 or 25 players, and much more like an orchestra. There was a very energetic superintendent, O'Donnell Sweeney, in charge of it. And it was a semi-classical thing. It's interesting, at that time there were 2 police forces in Ireland, the RAC around the country, and the DMP, the Dublin Metropolitan Police, and that continued on for a while. There was one single police force. The third one then is the Gallowglass Céilí band, who were extraordinarily popular, but their music is more allied to the Scottish sound of Jimmy Shand, who was a very popular person who toured Ireland for a long time. I think they were known as strict tempo bands, but they would use the saxophone. That's very radically different. And then the last one is the Castle Céilí band, which would probably be taken nowadays as the typical Céilí band, the typical traditional one. So here they go. You'll hear them say the Ballynakill, the DMP Garda band, all the policemen, the Gallowglass, and the Kilfenora, the Castle. First two recordings there, the first one was from 1931, the second from 1940, and then the other two sort of just around 1960. But you can hear a lot of difference in the music, and the deeper you went into the rhythmic sort of inflections, the more you'd hear the instrumentation, you know. So, many things, as we know, stopped during the Second World War. Things started and stopped. I've seen acetate disc and RT dated 1940, but I think the supply must have dried up there, and you can understand why it would have been an acetate disc in wartime. I'd say it would have been a luxury item, to be sure, depending on where they were imported from too. And I know that the station's engineers worked minor miracles just keeping the transmitters going with different, refashioning equipment and so forth, just to keep the station on the air. But the Second World War also indirectly gave rise to a major development in Irish radio broadcasting, because it is generally understood that the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister Eamon De Valera, felt that he hadn't gotten across his message about Irish neutrality in a sort of airwaves duel with Winston Churchill, who definitely had a sort of a thing about Ireland remaining neutral. It wasn't that De Valera saw his message as inferior, but it just hadn't got across. So there is more research to be done on this. It's not easy enough to, but I'm fairly convinced that he was persuaded that a shortwave radio transmitter would be significant in spreading the word from the Irish standpoint about partition. But in order to do this, it was necessary to beef up the station's resources, because it was a very minuscule station. It was under the control of the Department of Posts and Telegraphs, who didn't really want it, and they were also had to get money from the Department of Finance. And there's a very good book, 40 Years of Irish Broadcasting, by a man called Maurice Gorham, who was the director of broadcasting himself, and he just says this about what the expectation was for Radio Ireland. Despite the inadequacy of its resources, Radio Ireland was expected to do a great many things that were not demanded of other national radio services, most of them far better equipped. It was expected not merely to reflect every aspect of national activity, but to create activities that did not yet exist. It was expected to revive the speaking of Irish, to foster a taste for classical music, to revive Irish traditional music, to keep people on the farm, to sell goods and services of all kinds, from sausages to sweep tickets, to reunite the Irish people at home and those overseas, to end partition. All of this, in addition to a broadcasting duty to inform, educate and entertain, and all in a programme time amounting if advertising time was excluded, some 5.5 hours a day. And there's another description in his book of the amount of money available. The President of Ireland was visiting a concert one time, and they got short notice, so they felt there should be some entertainment for them. Said it was important there should be whiskey and biscuits to offer them. It was not easy to get a bottle of whiskey in Dublin on a Sunday evening in Dublin, but Charlie Kelly, who was the director of Radio Time, had recourse to Michael Bowles, and he managed it. Dennis McCulloch brought another bottle, Paddy Little and Dr. Larshey, he brought a bottle of sherry, and Charlie Kelly got the biscuits by telephoning his grocer at his private house. But the only way he could find the money for anything was to raid the petty cash, and he could be called to account for that. It was put to the Department of Finance there should be an entertainment account for occasions of this sort, but it was some years before this was done. In the meantime, the director's personal allowance was raised so as to allow an entertainment budget up to a limit of £75 a year. So, on foot of all that thing about the starting of the shortwave station, money came to Radio Ireland, and in 1947, known as the Annus Mirabilis of radio, the station got a news service, the expansion of the orchestras, a permanent actors company, the REP, the Radio Ireland Players, for radio drama, and importantly for traditional music, the MRU was created. This is the mobile recording unit, and it wasn't done for the purpose of recording music alone. The idea was general interest regional programs which would cover many aspects of an area: culture, history, economic and social or community activity, folklore, and somewhere in there, yes, music and song. The Gaeltacht, the Irish-speaking area, was specifically mentioned, and among the people heard were the piper Seamus Ennis, who heard his father playing there on the first day of broadcasting, a man called Sean McRae and Pontius of Clonlewin, all of whom were well disposed towards traditional music, traditional culture, and in Seamus' case, he was an expert in it, given his musical background and his previous work experience in the Three Candles Press and the Commission Bail, this is the Irish Folklore Commission. And it was just very important that musicians could now be recorded in their own home places rather than coming to Dublin and playing live in the intimidating surroundings of the Radio Éireann studio in Henry Street in Dublin, or in Radio Éireann Cork. And there are many stories of people feeling very ill at ease in the radio studio. Not just traditional players, but traditional players were at a particular disadvantage because they were not as attuned to the notion of formal performance as others. But there was some wonderful music recorded by Seamus Ennis with the mobile recording unit, and he was ideal for this work because he was a very respected player himself. He was viewed by other musicians, one of them themselves, Robert, was sort of an outsider descending from above. They knew that he knew what constituted a good performance, and they wanted to give it to him because they wanted to please him, because they liked him. And a lot of this music, there wasn't that much of it, but it survives on acetate discs, and some we issued, RTE issued on CDs, which did have an impact on later generations of players. He clearly, when you look at it, he recorded more music than he needed to. There's one of those half-hour programs about the area, Sliabh Luachra on the Cork-Kerry border, and I think I counted in half an hour, there's about 2 minutes music, but he recorded hours of music, but it is such quality performance. And this is just one example. It's two fiddle players. This is January 1949. Paul O'Keefe and Dennis Murphy, teacher and pupil, who really loved playing together, and these are slides. This is great music. You probably noticed there, one of the fiddle players plays an octave down, goes up and down, and that was, somebody told me that was generally the privilege of the older, more seasoned player, in that case, Bob O'Keefe. Seamus Ennis left Radio Éireann in 1951 and went to the BBC, but many things were changing in this decade, in the 50s, and the BBC had a collecting scheme and programme, As I Roved Out, was presented by Seamus Ennis and others. It was brought on air to justify the scheme, as far as I know. It discovered a sort of a latent popularity for folk music, which hadn't previously been recognised. It went from 1953 to 1958, and that was in Ireland as well as in Britain. And perhaps this spurred Radio Éireann to sort of emulate it or to match it. And there was a change in the presentation style from that very formal thing that I was saying about someone just announcing the stuff. And in that decade, some of the things you noticed were, it was just a general interest in folk music internationally through maybe the work of Alan Lomax, Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie, Ewan MacColl, carrying on into the 60s. And there was just a new awareness of folk music, more engaged, maybe more respectful, there was more value placed in it. I think there was I understand there's a general change of attitude which followed World War II, a sense of liberation, people looking for something new, they don't want to go back to what they did have. It was known as hysteresis. In Ireland, the founding of Cultus Cultúr Éireann and the starting of the big music festival, Fleadh Cheoil, the first flag was in Mullingar in the Midlands, second in Monaghan. The Sean-Maria, there's music, and the film Misha Eyre, 1959, the Clancy Brothers singing in the United States and back here. And in 1953 there was an imperfect survey of listenership but it discovered, again in Ireland, an interest in folk music which they thought was in the country, but they didn't think was in the cities. So they brought on air a program called Take the Floor, which was only supposed to run for 6 weeks, but on it went until 1965. And it was sort of the popular music at the time, including ballads, Cayley and old time, and also, in a strange way, it was a sort of precursor of the show band era. In 1953, Gaelin started. They had a sort of a stage show called Cabaret Gaelin. They issued some very important 78 records in 1956, 78 RPM. The first time that sean-nós, unaccompanied traditional Irish singing, was to be heard on record. Claddagh Records started in 1959. Their first LP was Piper Leo Rosen, the first LP ever recorded in Ireland by an Irish company of traditional music. And then there were two huge things, nothing to do with music, which brought change for radio. And one was electrification, first in the city and then in the rural areas. And that's reflected in the sale of licenses, because suddenly people didn't have to charge their batteries for a week. And when it came to the cities, then there was a flood of these now redundant wet and dry battery radios which went to the country. So suddenly everyone was hearing radio, and that's reflected if you look at the sale of radio licenses. And then the second one was the arrival of tape recording to replace these acetate discs, because durations and functionality improved enormously, and there was still no television. I've heard a figure of 1 million listens for a program, Cayley House. Perhaps that's a bit exaggeration. You do hear reports of Irish emigres in London climbing lampposts to get better reception, but there's no doubt about it. This was the decade up to the mid-60s when television really kind of took off. And a man called Ciarán Mac Mahon was hired in late 1954 in response to this sort of new era and what we were hearing from the BBC, etc. Just all that was happening. Now, he wouldn't claim, I would say, the same musical expertise as Seamus Ellis. His expertise was more in language and song, but he brought something very important in terms of generating respectability. He had a particular personality that was very likeable and easygoing. Musicians liked him, but also I think the sort of establishment liking. I have a sense that liking for him in some way was mirrored by a liking or an acceptance for traditional Irish music. He had programs such as A Job of Journey Work, travelling around the country, and Ceolta Tíre. But certainly this was an era when traditional music, you may say, sort of came in from the cold in some way in terms of popularity and acceptance. And when I'm saying about informal sort of presentation style, you'll hear it very much in this next one, where you heard Dennis Murphy playing there with Padraig O'Keeffe. This is where Ciarán meets Dennis Murphy for a recording session.
Now, Dennis, how about the song? It's a poem, I think you were talking about.
Yes.
What's the name of it?
All the bridges full of fish, all the bridges button on.
All the bridges
full of dishes, all the button on.
Right, Dennis Murphy will play it for us. I see you have it now. But what's this again you had for it?
All the bridges full of stitches, all the bridges buckling down. How the bridges full of stitches, how the buckling down.
Exactly. Play it.
In the 1960s, this sort of programming continued, like Ciarán's programs, Ceolta Tíre, Cayley House, Take the Floor. But the music scene was expanding, as mentioned, for the 50s. You know, there were these folk groups like Emmett Spicer and the Johnsons and the Ballads of the Dubliners. They generated much popularity. I'm not certain that the Dubliners actually had much radio exposure on pure traditional folk music programs. I think that market was sort of cornered, but they were played in general programs, and certainly it was the spirit of the time. And just to say something brief about singing is interesting. There are two types of singing. You surely could subdivide it further. But traditional singing in Irish, the sean-nós, was very seldom heard until the Irish language station, Radio Belfast, came on the air. And I think that's just because the music management in Radio Air didn't really accept it. Different modal structures, vocal techniques, and the absence of accompaniment meant that it was admissible on air more so as folklore. There's a woman called Marnie Ceolta, and she's still alive. She's in Cork, she tells of her experience of applying for a broadcast, being approved, going through all the bureaucratic process, and then she sent up the form with the repertoire, and then she got it back in the post saying, it's fine, but you left out the space. There's a space where you left your accompanist's name. And she said, but I'd never played with accompaniment in life, and that was the end of it. The broadcast didn't happen, so that would tell you. And Seamus Ennis corroborates that experience to some large degree. There were ballad programmes in English, one particular one, the Ballad Makers, Saturday night. And an interesting thing there is the songs were collected by people like Brian McMahon, who was a collector, on a wire recorder and sent to Dublin. But the actual recordings weren't played. They were learned by trained singers or actors, people like Sean O'Sheahan or Joe Lynch. And it's an important distinction. The original singers weren't heard on air, but the songs were taken and learned by others. And that's not as surprising as it might seem, because when Ewan MacColl was pioneering the radio ballad series, the way that these sort of programmes were done was the interviews were recorded, typed up, rehearsed by actors, and they then spoke the lines into the programme. But it was when Ewan MacColl and Peggy Seeger and Charles Parker realised that the original voices were more striking, they actually used the field recordings, which nowadays you wouldn't think twice about it, but at that stage this is sort of revolutionary. It's a very important moment, very precise moment actually, with the programme called The Ballad of John Axon in the history of documentary making in radio. And the major change or feature of 1960 was the appearance on the scene of Sean O'Reilly. Now he had been a very important person, I would say, the assistant to the director of music as a very young man, maybe too young. He was just out of University College Cork. He was 22 years old. That lasted for 2 years. I don't think it suited him, and I don't think it necessarily suited Radio Ireland, because it was a desk job, and his creative tendency didn't have much scope, and he left. But after a spell in France, he came back to Ireland, and he did work for Radio Ireland. He was the musical director in the Abbey Theatre. And it's not possible to list all of his achievements in composition, arranging, teaching, but there are two ones that are important connected to radio. In 1961, he prepared a 14-part series called Our Musical Heritage, which was the first in-depth treatment of traditional music. His priorities are evident in the way he distributed the subtopics. The first 4 poems were on Shanlow's traditional singing, then 5 to 7 the uilleann pipes, 8 and 9 the fiddle, 10 the flute, 11 the tin whistle, 12 the accordion, the concertina, the 13 was group playing, and the 14 was a summary. And it's very likely that if he didn't have the background and the qualifications he did have, the series would have been made, but he spoke the language of the music department within Radio Éireann. So here is an extract from Our Musical Heritage, number 13, where he talks about the Cayley Band, and this leads to talking about ensemble playing in traditional music, and it previews the setting up of a group, which I think he already actually had underway. His son Peadar told me, that he sometimes would hit hard to make a point, and you'll hear that, but he was a powerful figure, O'Reilly.
And so we come to the Cayley Band. What about the Cayley Band? Well, this much. Irish music, as I've already pointed out a number of times, is essentially a solo individual effort. It is essentially a matter of the individual player or singer giving free rein within the limits of the art to his own musical personality. It isn't a group activity. However, due to one reason or another, the idea of making a group activity of it at times has come to stay. It's a common thing to hear 2 or 3 players playing together, but in such small numbers, it is still possible for them to preserve their individuality. For example, you might get a piper and a fiddle player playing together, or a fiddle player and a flute player, etc. So, in 1926, Seamus Clandillan, a former director of broadcasting for Radio Éireann, conceived the idea of a Cayley Band, a number of musicians playing together, usually about 7, 8 or 9. One of the most successful of the early groups was the old Ballynakill Cayley Band, which consisted of 2 fiddles, 2 flutes and 2 accordions. There were neither drums, piano nor double bass. This was the early state of things. One would have expected that after a certain period of time had elapsed, that the organisers of Cayley Bands would have managed to work out some kind of compromise between the sole traditional idea and the idea of a group activity. But one would indeed have been disappointed. Instead of developing this kind of compromise, the Cayley Band leaders took the easy way and wrong way out, tending more and more to imitate swing or jazz bands which play an entirely different kind of music and are organised on an entirely different principle. First, they added piano and drums, then double bass, and then the final insult, saxophones, guitars and banjos. abandoned entirely are all the most important principles of traditional music. The whole idea of variation, the whole idea of the personal utterance. Instead, they take hold of a tune and everyone belts away at it all the time without stopping. The result is a rhythmic but meaningless noise, with about as much relation to music as the buzzing of a bluebottle in an upturned jam jar. Now, I have given a fair amount of thought to the idea of playing Irish music as a group activity, since it seems to me that this is one of the most important ways in which Irish music could develop.
And he did this, and he put together his ensemble, Kiltary Cool. The thinking behind it derived from his different musical experience. He was a jazz pianist, he understood the value of each instrument taking a solo passage. He was very well skilled in classical music, he understood the concept of a small chamber or folk orchestra. And he did understand traditional music. He had the background from his family. He wasn't a regular practitioner, but he clearly, when you hear the music of Kiltary Cool and his music, you know that he knew what it was about. And when he put this together, the Radio Ireland of today embraced the idea very willingly. I think it represented them, first of all, an attractive musical programme idea, but also, I think, an escape from the Kelly Band, which was really proliferating at that time, and it's hard to see where the Kelly Band was going musically. He would have found, I'd say, that sort of sentiment. I'm sure he found a willing ear. So, between 1961 and 1969, he brought this group together, Kiltary Cool, and they made, rough count, 209 programmes, maybe more, maybe less, but they were on air very regularly in two very different series, one called Rocker and Realik, which was from the music department, and it was a serious one. It featured complicated enough arrangements, Shannon singing, almost accompaniment, and spoken verse and prose in Irish. Then Flash on Radio was made before an audience. It was a more informal program. There was storytelling, there was singing of ballads by Sean O'Shea, and there was an on-air competition. And I can't see how Kiltary Cool would have survived if it wasn't a regular broadcast band. There were concerts, okay, but very few, because just Sean he was interested in proving a point about ensemble playing and the artistic yield from that. And what he did might seem simple nowadays, but it's like, as I said here, someone had to be the first person to put wheels under a suitcase. Nobody thinks that's a big thing now, but someone did it first. And Kiltary Cool played their music with great spirit, and I think you can say that the Chieftains grew from Kiltary Cool, and the first 7 or 8 albums derived in some large measure, I think, from what Sean O'Reilly was doing. But in their case, it was a performing group and one of the most successful and long-lasting music groups, not just in Ireland. Now, something would have happened, but I think it's without Sean O'Reilly and without the contribution from radio, it would have been something different, I think. So I just give you, I know the time is running, I'll just give you a short excerpt of what O'Reilly was doing with Kiltary Cool. This is a Jig Morrison singing. You'd hear the arrangement of the solo passages. I just take it out there. I mean, it's a fine recording, but just time-wise, what he was doing. I said this is sort of the beauty and the tune and simplicity of it. He chose his players very well, and Sean disbanded Kiltary Cool in 1970. The Chieftains started in 1964, They were running in parallel. A lot of people think that there was Ceolfrith Colan and then there was the Chieftains. They were running in parallel, but he disbanded in 1971 and died very shortly afterwards. And when you look at all his achievements and his work rate, and you realise that he was only 40 years and a couple of months when he died, it was an astonishing life. He sort of lived at double speed. The 1970s, another decade, equally different to what we've done before, and it further sort of develops. And it was a dynamic and exciting time. Certain things came together, following on logic from the way things had gone up to then. One of the chief movers at this time was Tony McMahon. He was a very independent, forthright, influential person in traditional music over a long time. He had presented television programs in the late 60s, Bring Down the Lamp, Big Den of Kyoil. He started a group in 1971 called 1691. He left soon enough. He started the Bothy Band. He left that too. There was another group formed in Galway, Dedanon. And the one which, for me, exemplifies this coming together of these sort of different strands is Planxty, because you have the folk music background of Donal Lunny. You have Christy Moore, who was a ballad singer, I suppose, at that stage, but became interested in the sort of social justice singing, the work of Ewan MacColl, Andy Irvine, also a folk singer, but was very taken with Woody Guthrie. And then you have Liam O'Flynn, who would be coming from another world altogether in the traditional music world with this piping, but it all comes together in Planxty. And Tony McMahon became a radio producer in 1974, not in the music department, but in what was known, slightly pejorative term, light music, which was anything but orchestra, what's now known as the performing groups. And the first presenter was a man called Micheál O'Donnell, who played at the Bothy Band. And this programme reflected very much this new sort of world of what was happening. It was kind of right up to date. Not in a sort of an adulatory way. I mean, it wasn't unquestioning, because I think the programme saw itself to some extent as the conscience of traditional music, and it was an opinion former, as well as reflecting the things that were happening. And there were reviews of new recordings, which I don't think had happened before, and these could be quite harsh at times. But that was the nature of the programme. The main guide, I would say, to the editorial views would have been Tony McMahon's feelings and tastes in the music. And he continued to 1978, and then there was a new producer, Harry Bradshaw. Probably the programme didn't have such a strong editorial line, but they made many valuable recordings and documentary programmes on traditional musicians, and there was a lot of meticulous research and something you should never undervalue, simply hard work went into them. And also a similar programme called the Irish Phonograph, which located and told the stories behind many of the commercial recording of traditional music. Again, a lot of good research and hard work. That was presented by Nicholas Carroll, and again Harry Bradshaw. May have been sort of something instrumental in the generation of the Irish traditional music archive. But just here very briefly now is a flavour of the long note, not music, but there used to be a sort of a news section every week.
First of all, news about two interesting books now on the market. One of them, a new publication entitled Whistle and Sing, is the work of Portadown's Eamon Jordan. It's a collection of some of the most popular songs and tunes you'll hear at musical sessions all over the country, and it also includes chapters on the rudiments of whistle playing, piping, fiddling and box playing. The book is well laid out and easy to follow, and is a useful addition to the body of traditional music tutors now on sale. It sells for £1.33, and Eamon Jordan of 12 Ballyoran Heights in Portadown, County Armagh, will help you with any inquiries you might have. The second book I mentioned isn't new. It's a revised edition of Padraig Colum's Treasury of Irish Folklore, an anthology of folk tales, traditions, customs and lore. 300 stories in all, and 30 songs are included in the book, and it sells for £3.30.
I just take that out again, we're running behind time, but that was a sort of, the programme kind of engaged with the traditional music world. That was Micheál O'Donnell, who was the first presenter of the programme. He was also the singer with the Bothy Band. He died kind of tragically, and he was, again, a highly skilled person. Another development generated by Harry Bradshaw at this time, just coming up to the 1980s, was the coming together of the uilleann pipes and the orchestra. Harry had been told that Sean Daly, the composer, would be interesting as someone to work with on a programme that Harry was producing. It was called The Living Bridge. It was sort of an experimental programme. So he met Sean and they discussed ideas, and Sean mentioned that he was at that time reading the explorer Tim Severn's book describing the building and the subsequent journey of a boat such as had existed in the 6th century and might have been sailed to America by St. Brendan the Navigator. And as you know, Tim Severn's voyage was successful. It proved that it was possible for such a journey to be made. It didn't actually say that it was made, but it was possible because Tim Severn only used the materials which would have been available in the 6th century. So the idea which came from Harry and from Sean was the composition of a piece of music to describe the Brendan voyage, with the pipes representing the boat, and then the orchestra represented the elements, the wind, the sea, the weather. And the programme was made with Tim Severin narrating, and it led to the separate recording of the orchestral suite, the Brendan Voyage, but that was in 1980, and it still held up as a groundbreaking idea and a piece of work, and it's also a superb listen, particularly live if you get the chance, but it paved the way for many ideas with the pipes in the orchestra. It had happened once before with Leo Ralston, but it just didn't work on that day. And again, would this have happened without radio? Maybe so, maybe not. This is just a short excerpt of it again. Go on a second. Hold on a second. I did very well up to that now with the other. Go on. Very exciting, as I say, to see it live. So we're coming to the last extract. That was Liam O'Flynn and the RT, the National Symphony Orchestra. So the Long Note ran from 1974 to 1992, and since that time there have been various programmes. I've been involved in some Ornon Sounds Tradition, the Flat Club, the Rolling Wave at present, and we continue to broadcast traditional music on Radio 1. But there are changes, and we've heard them there. No radio station, including our own, is sole trader in the way that it was. You've heard of in the past, like when Kieran McMahon arrived with his mobile recording unit in Killadoo in the 1950s at the house of Seamus Connolly. It was big news, talked about for years afterwards. One neighbour saw this van outside the house and all the wires leading into the Connolly's house, and he assumed that someone in the house had TB, this sort of stuff. But now, if you see a microphone at an event, it's nothing. If you look at the annual recitals in Midtown Abbey, there'll be 20 or 30 people at least recording material on their phone. And the Irish Traditional Music Archive records all the recitals. Regina Wells does a lot, T.G. Carter does a lot. And there's a mountain of music available online via the music organisations like the Peabody Illan archives such as ITMA, and it's easy for anyone and everyone to make and access and share recordings. And also the music after the Bothy Band moved on to a sort of the electric high-powered sound of the moving horse, and then in recent times kind of turned back to a softer, more gentle acoustic sound. And just very briefly, the last extract is we recorded and broadcast one of the Gloamings concerts in March at the concert hall, and that's kind of where we're at anyway. Just as
Quick questions, do you have any?
Or comments. You don't have to ask questions. You don't have to ask questions. You can
Yes.
just say something.
Yeah, I'd like to ask, there's a wide-based theory that the 78 record sort of almost spelled the death of regional style because it polarised the playing of people like Michael Coleman and made everyone want to play like that. But it sounds like radio was the opposite because you had enough diversity within the playing to support. What's your feeling on that? Did it help or hinder?
I think the regional styles, no matter what, were going to die anyway because, you know, if you go back to that era, people's, not just their musical experience, but their life experience was essentially within a bicycle ride of where they lived. It's quite remarkable. I've spoken to people, you know, and they lived in parts of County Clare, and you know, they would go to Ennis possibly only at the age of 14 or 15, you know. So you're right, the 78s did a particular thing, all right, the Michael Coleman. I mean, that became almost a bit too much in the sense that it wasn't just that they were particularly liked, but actually other styles were sort of being rejected in some way. Radio would have contributed to that too. I mean, you know, there was that fiddle player heard, Paul O'Keefe. Someone told me once, like he was living in Kerry and there was a famous fiddle player, Sean McGuire in Belfast. They never would have met. There's no way they would have met. But O'Keefe came into the pub one night and he said, I heard a fiddle player today on the radio called McGuire. He said, I can tell you he's good. But that would just be the beginning of that mixing. But you know, it happened in London with all those emigrants and so I think it's just about having, the difference nowadays is, I suppose, that, you know, if you grew up in, let's say, the Hookhead Peninsula or somewhere, or the one County Clare, your only experience was going to be who was teaching you. And therefore you absorb that unconsciously. Nowadays I would say a band like Altar or something, you can decide to play in a different style. So they can sort of decide to be a Donegal band to some extent, you know. But it was inevitable that was going to happen because it's just a reflection of people's lives, I would say. But the Coleman thing was a particular thing, all right. Those 78s come back and he really had a huge influence, all right. But it was going to happen anyway, I'd say, you know. But he was adopted, like for competitions of this guy, and you could talk at length about competitions as well, but I think that he particularly became the standard. So people, it was almost like, you know, you were playing like Coleman or you weren't playing like Coleman. That was a bit too much. And even the sort of tunes, like regional tunes like polka and so forth, weren't accepted in competition. So that went too far in my book anyway. Certainly, I love the particular Steve Luke, Kerry music. That's my own kind of fancy in life, you know.
Thank you. I think we'll have to, maybe one last question. Yes, please.
Yes, I remember hearing some recordings of Irish radio programme. I just don't remember it, but it had some beautiful examples of Irish music from all over the country. You may know that the theme song was the song The Lark in the Clear Air.
Oh yeah.
And I can't remember the name of the producer. It was the same producer, presenter each time.
Kieran Monaghan, and he was the one interviewing Dennis Murphy there when he sang "Oh, the Bridges Full of Stitches," and he was a major figure.
Yeah, there's some lovely Sean Ross.
Yes, that was a Sunday morning program.
That's right, yes. And it was recorded onto LP, I think.
He made
I bought some of the LPs.
Yes. I mean, that program took in traditional music, but also sort of light kind of art music and poetry and that. But it was a very soft Sunday morning listen for people. I remember Kieran used to say that my job is not to wake people up, it's to put them to sleep again.
Yes.
But he was a man who was venerated just for his personality and that. You know, he brought a particular, nobody would argue with him. I think that the sort of goodwill that was felt towards him translated into a goodwill towards traditional music when it was a bit of an underground thing, you know. Maybe it's an accident of where he was at the time, but he certainly had a pleasant personality and all that, you know. And a great radio voice too, as a deep sort of radio voice. You know. Yeah.
We have the folks. I think Peter, you're staying with us.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you again for this.